Joining me now is NBC News senior White House correspondent Garrett, Haake, NPR technology correspondent Bobby Allyn, and NBC News senior national political reporter Sahil Kapur. Garrett, let me start with you at the White House. What were your key takeaways from that really remarkable Oval Office appearance with Elon Musk and the president?
Yeah, Kristen, look, both of these men have had famous blow-ups with other powerful men with whom they have shared power or the spotlight over the years. And this felt to me like an effort to make sure the end of the Elon Musk era here at the White House doesn't include one of those blow-ups. That both sides wanted to go out looking like everything is absolutely fine. They're still a team. They still have shared goals and a shared mission, and to try to make sure this is a smooth transition for the world's most wealthy man and the world's most powerful man to be going their separate ways. You saw the president, who I think has come to realize he can command quite the spotlight with these midday press availabilities that aren't proper press conferences, pushing a number of false claims, including the degree to which DOGE cuts have worked, the price of gas, which he artificially lowered in this hearing, or in this availability. And he's able to do it without a lot of pushback, given the structure of these things, which are pool-only events, when the White House now controls the composition of the pool. So you saw pretty, I think, tepid pushback on a number of these points, letting Musk and Trump set the narrative as Musk returns to his business empire, at least as his full-time gig.
Well, and Garrett, it's a great point, because one of the threads that was looming over this availability was this report from the New York Times saying that Elon Musk was using drugs like ketamine and ecstasy while on the campaign trail. NBC News has not confirmed that reporting. But what is the White House saying? Was Elon Musk pressed about this at all today?
Pressed is not the verb I would use, Kristen. There was one kind of tepid effort to ask about this. When Musk heard New York Times, he took the very Trumpian tactic of cutting off the question and focusing on the Times and his complaints about their reporting on issues related to Donald Trump, and essentially stifled the question before the word drugs could even be asked. As for the White House, they've responded to questions about the drug use or the alleged drug use by defending Elon Musk in more general terms, talking about his stellar business career and the sacrifices he's made. I think the closest you're going to get to any acknowledgement of this is the way in which both Musk and the president in the Oval Office today talked about how he was the target of slings and arrows and of tough reporting and attacks along the way. But nobody has dealt with the substance of this report yet from either the White House or Musk himself.
Interesting. So, Garrett, what happens next to DOGE? You heard Elon Musk there say that his team at DOGE will stay in place. You heard President Trump say that Elon Musk may be leaving, but he's not going far. What does all of this add up to without Elon Musk physically at the White House?
Yeah, look, I think Elon Musk and the White House have both learned that cutting this kind of spending that they've talked about is really hard. There's a reason it hasn't been done in generations. And they were at loggerheads, be it, between Musk wanting to make more significant changes at Social Security and the president wanting him to keep his hands off, to various cabinet agencies ultimately pushing back against Musk's efforts to gut their staff, to Congress not yet fully grappling with the kinds of reforms and changes that would be really necessary to change the trajectory of government spending. That'll be the next big fight, if it's a big fight, with the rescissions package. That's essentially a bill to undo previous government-approved or congressional-approved spending going to the Hill in short order. The budget director was talking about that today. If Congress is really willing to walk back money that Congress has already approved to be spent, that's the kind of structural change that would ultimately be necessary to make the kind of long-term cuts Elon Musk wants. I, as a former congressional reporter, am skeptical that they will be able to do that. But that's what this will look like. So the DOGE, ethos continues, but the low-hanging fruit are gone, and the difficult structural changes still have to be dealt with if they're going to be.
All right, Garrett, Haake, thank you so much for your great reporting from the White House. Bobby, let me turn to you. Let's talk about how Elon Musk views his time at the White House. He set out and said he was going to cut $1 trillion. Then it became $1 trillion. Now he's saying he found about $100 billion in savings. Does he believe his time at the White House was a success?
Well, I think, as Garrett just said, Musk became increasingly disenchanted over just how difficult it is to cut costs within the federal government. Musk is used to coming into, say, a company like Twitter, X, right, and saying, I'm going to cut 80% of the staff. I'm going to cut contracts. I'm going to end real estate relationships and just do it in one fell swoop. But in the federal government, it's a very different situation. And he came in to try to launch a war against the bureaucracy. And some might say he was ultimately defeated by the bureaucracy. And, really for his companies, it's been really, really tough. I think one of the big surprises for Musk was just how much of a brand liability being in the White House would be, especially for Tesla. I don't think he fully appreciated just how much of a backlash there would be among owners of Tesla cars, among investors, among others in the business community. He feels really ostracized right now, and he thinks, you know what? I tried my best in the White House. I really want to come in and fight waste, fraud, and abuse, and I'm leaving feeling a little disenchanted, a little frustrated, but he knows he has to get back to Tesla. He has to get back to SpaceX because at the end of the day, those are his full-time jobs.
Yeah, there'll be a lot of scrutiny about his return to those companies. There's been also a lot of scrutiny about his relationship with President Trump. How do you assess his relationship as he's set to walk out the door? I can't remember the last time I saw a departure like this one where President Trump is praising the work that someone did in the Oval Office.
Yeah, it's really kind of a soft exit, isn't it? So he's no longer going to be at the helm of DOGE, but he's still going to be an advisor in some capacity. And I think Elon thinks having an inroad into the White House can really help him from a regulatory perspective. Let's not forget, there are dozens of government investigations into Elon Musk's business empire. He has billions of dollars in federal government subsidies that are propping up some of his companies like SpaceX. So having a direct line into President Trump, he knows can help lift the bottom line of his companies at a time when they are feeling besieged, at a time when Tesla reported that its profits in the first quarter of the year are down 71%. So Elon Musk knows having an ally in the White House is only going to really help his future and the preservation of his business interests. But within the White House, it's become very clear that dealing with Elon is kind of a pain. And I think many there are very relieved to have him out of the White House.
Yeah, part of the story there, his clashes with various cabinet officials. Bobby Allyn, thank you so much. We really appreciate your perspective. Let's turn to Sahil Kapur. Sahil, thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate it. Well, we know that just this week, Elon Musk was quite critical of the so-called Big Beautiful Bill. He said it could potentially undermine the work of DOGE and that there just aren't enough cuts in it. How might that impact the debate on Capitol Hill, this Big Beautiful Bill now moving to the Senate?
I don't think it'll have much of an impact, Kristen. I think Republican lawmakers are going to decide what's in or out of that bill on their own basis. I do think the DOGE project has been objectively a failure by Elon Musk's own standards. He came in with a lot of bravado, brandishing that chainsaw, talking about how he's going to cut trillions of dollars from the budget and balance the budget. They're doing the opposite. That $2 trillion that he was talking about cutting, the Big Beautiful Bill would increase the deficit on net by more than $2 trillion. So one could argue that the White House was never really serious about this goal in the beginning, and that there was some PR benefit to talking about, the DOGE goal, the government efficiency. Elon Musk ultimately treated this idea of government efficiency as something nobody had really thought about until he came along, as opposed to something people had tried to do but repeatedly failed to do because it's extremely difficult. He went after pieces of the budget that are popular to cut, like foreign aid. Firing a bunch of civil servants has a lot of support among conservative voters, but those are small slices of the budget. He clearly did not come in with a plan to build the coalition needed to make the kind of cuts that he was talking about.
Well, what's interesting, Sahil, is that what we're hearing from Elon Musk is not altogether different than what we're hearing from some Republicans in the Senate who oppose this bill right now, Senator Ron Johnson, Senator Rand Paul, who say this just adds too much to the deficit, that they're not going to be able to get behind it. You've been covering Capitol Hill for a long time. Talk a little bit about these dynamics. We know that House Speaker Mike Johnson, who I'll be speaking with exclusively this Sunday on Meet the Press, has said to his colleagues in the Senate, please don't make too many trims because we need to be able to pass it through the House one more time before it gets to the president's desk.
Absolutely. So Republican leaders in the House and the Senate are facing a squeeze on two ends. John Thune, the Senate Majority Leader, is dealing with a group of fiscal hawks, including Senator Ron Johnson, including Senator Rand Paul, who want the cuts to be a lot steeper in order to vote for it. Then on the other hand, he's dealing with senators who are already queasy with the level of Medicaid spending cuts, and they're already queasy with the clean energy funding cuts in there, and are questioning some of the existing cuts. Again, as Garrett was talking about, it's a lot easier to talk in the abstract about spending cuts. It's much harder when you get down to the ground level because, frankly, many voters are not well informed about what the government spends money on. And the fact that most of government spending is actually either very popular or has a lot of political support. One little note on Elon Musk, he came in talking about how he's going to reduce military spending, that there was a lot of fat and bloat in the Pentagon, which, many people would argue there is. Yeah. It turns out this big, beautiful bill increases military spending by $150 billion. That is quite a metaphor.
Yeah, a lot of Republicans saying you have to deal with the bloat there, which is, of course, one of the most challenging places. Sahil, Kapur, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.